Here at the Marshfield Church of Christ, we are committed to glorifying God and uplifting one another through worship, spiritual growth, outreach, fellowship, and service to the community. This morning, we're going to be looking a little bit at the idea of outreach, particularly outreach and the model which Jesus gave here. Anyone ever done any studying about how to start a mission work? It's kind of an interesting question, right? So if we were to go into, I'll pick the country that I actually did the study on this. If we were to go to Sweden, where at the last count that I saw, there are 12 members of the church in the country, and none of them were born there. They all have moved there. If we were to go into Sweden, how would we start things off? How would you go into a place where no one has ever really taught the gospel in its entirety? What would you do? I have some friends who are missionaries in Laos. Now, Laos is an interesting country. So Laos is a country where it is technically illegal to be a Christian, but it has open borders and allows for travel. Almost like a paradoxical type thing. So you can let people in, but to actually convert someone would be illegal. Another interesting thing about that country is there's a large population that visits or sometimes migrates from Thailand and China, where if you taught someone there, they could take it back home. So we're going to get to that. That's going to be the practical portion of our lesson today. But we're going to start with something that I wouldn't say is completely impractical, but it's much less practical than how to do personal evangelism. All right. How many people, by show of hands, I'm asking you for participation, how many people have avoided reading Revelation in depth because you don't understand it that well? Okay. How many people have avoided books of prophecy in general because you don't feel like you understand them that well? Okay. Well, this morning, we're going to use a passage from our reading today as sort of a case study to look more closely at how we should deal with prophecy. Now, you may have seen this passage before, and you may have had questions about it. So Jesus here says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from the heavens. Now here's the question that I pose to you this morning. When? Because he doesn't really tell us anything as far as the timetable of when he saw this happen. I've talked to the young men before, and it's almost become a running joke of, is this preterist or eschatological? Now, the reason it's become kind of a running joke is because those two words are extremely complicated, and it's not something that you would talk about in a teenage class. But it is kind of funny to think about how you got these two big, long words, and they have really simple meanings, okay? Is this something that has already happened? Preterist. Is this something that's going to happen? Eschatological. And that's usually the two questions that we're trying to determine when we look at any piece of prophecy. Now, one of the things about prophecy that I've talked about this before is really neglected in our conversations is that prophecy does not necessarily mean you're telling about something in the future. Prophecy is being a mouthpiece for God, and it includes both foretelling, talking about things that are going to happen, and forthtelling, telling the message of God as it already is. Whenever you read through the prophets in the Old Testament, many times they're not actually telling the people of Israel about anything new. They're telling them about things that are going on. Now, sometimes they are telling the people about things that are happening now that they would have no practical way to learn about. So if you're in Jerusalem, going over to Egypt to find out what's currently going on with the king is not something that's exactly practical to just pick up and go. You can't get on Google and say, Egyptian news, 800 BC. That doesn't work that way. So in some senses, God is allowing these people to act as mouthpieces to help them understand how he is working in the nations outside of the Jewish people and outside of Israel. But sometimes he is telling them about something that is going to happen. So all of the prophecies that we learn about the Messiah are things that were foretold. The more complicated thing is that sometimes it's both. Sometimes there's something that's happening at that present time that it's talking about. But it points to something later, something that's going to be a greater fulfillment of whatever that is. So here's where we come to the question of what this is talking about with Jesus seeing Satan fall. There's a term, and if you want to write this down, it's P-R-O-L-E-P-S-I-S, prolepsis. Prophetic prolepsis is a term that refers to whenever you talk about something in the past tense that actually hasn't happened yet. The way I explain this to people is whenever you are talking about something and you add the phrase, it's already happened. For example, whenever Alabama lines up against virtually any team, it's like they've already won, okay? Even though they haven't played a snap, it's like they've already won because they're so much better that it's like they've already beaten them. I know there was one time that Alabama played this Division II team that's in Alabama, and they won by 75 points. Okay? It's that kind of thing. It's so set in stone that you don't actually even have to watch it play out. You know it's going to happen. Okay? So that's prolepsis. And that's one possible way to interpret this particular passage. So whenever we are talking about the falling of Satan from heaven, this could refer, not necessarily, but this could refer to what's going to happen at the end. It's going to could refer to how Satan will ultimately lose. Okay, that would be a proleptic interpretation. Personally, I don't think that's what it's talking about, but that's to help you understand that's what that would be. He's talking about it in the past, but Jesus is so sure of the victory of God over Satan that he can talk about it in the past. He can talk about it like it already happened. Okay, so that's one way to take this. Now the other two, and that would be an end time interpretation. Now there's two other ways that you could take this that have to do with, like I was talking about, the preterist or things that have already happened view. So in one sense, Jesus could be talking about this actual event. He could be talking specifically about whenever he sent out the 72 and the report that they had back. And you notice one of the things he says is you'll have the power to tread on snakes and scorpions. Anybody think of anything else that has to do with Satan whenever they hear that kind of phraseology? Genesis 3. So there could be some reference back to this seed promise where God said that there's going to be one who's going to come after you, and you may injure him. You're going to bruise his heel, but ultimately he's going to crush your head. So it could be a reference to that, that it was just what Jesus had done, and by giving them those powers, Satan was no longer able to do the things that he did. The problem with that is we do still see some amount of demon possession that continues into Acts. So saying that that was completely done away with at that time is kind of hard because yes, he was bound and he was overcome, but we can see in the books of 2 Peter and in Jude that there is going to be an ultimate binding that takes place later. And a note from that is, just because he was struck out of heaven doesn't necessarily mean that he was bound either. So this brings up a question that a lot of times people talk about, which is, well, where did Satan come from? Now, I can tell you that there's a lot of views on the origin of Satan that are heretical, okay? And depending on how much you've been influenced by culture, how much you've been influenced by popular literature, and even old literature, your view of Satan may have been colored. Now, when we think about Satan, there's really three possible, philosophically possible, ways that Satan could have come into existence. Okay? So philosophically, there's three. That doesn't mean any of them are true, or only one of them can be true. So the first one is Satan always existed. Now, we know that that's not true because that would put him on the same plane as God and would have equal merit and equal power with God. We know that's not true because of the way that God interacts with him. If you remember in the book of Job, whenever Satan is asking to have Job, he has to ask for permission to every single thing that he does. The second option is that Satan is a created being, but he's a being that was created evil. That also has some problems. If we say that God is all good and all loving, and he creates this being that is basically the embodiment of evil, even though he has not directly caused evil, he has indirectly allowed evil to come into this world. So even if he didn't tell Satan, hey, go do evil things, if he created him as an evil being, he has brought evil into this world. And that goes against God's character. So the third option, and the one that makes the most sense, is he was created good, and at some point he rebelled and started doing things that were evil. There have been several different propositions. What it seems to be, based on what we read in Ezekiel's account of the king of Tyre and Isaiah's account of the king of Babylon, it at least suggests that there was some force greater that came to this world, and that Satan was in some way a fallen angel. That's the most likely, at least something that was non-human. Now, you could say he was a member of the host or something along those lines, but basically, he's not God, he's not human, he's something else. And you can take that to be whatever you want to. There's several different categories in the host that it could be. Now, speaking on his origin, at some point he had to stop being good. My personal belief is that is what is being talked about here. That Jesus actually witnessed what happened whenever he was struck out of heaven, and the events that he was seeing here on earth reminded him of that event. I still think that there is further casting out to occur, and that's what we read about in 2 Peter and in Jude. But this was evidence that God was now acting in this world, and the world was never going to be the same going forward. Now, when was he taken out of heaven? That's a lot more speculative. There is a scroll that was fairly recently found called the War Scroll that is, as far as I can find, the oldest recollection of this cosmic battle that took place in heaven before time began. It dates back to, I believe, about 750 BC. Now, as you can imagine, anything that sounds as cool as a battle that's within heaven is going to have all sorts of different ways that people are going to interpret it and speculate and make movies about, right? I don't know if you've ever read, it's called the Dark Materials Saga, but that's the Golden Compass, Amber Spyglass, and the Subtle Knife. They together, the last scene is this retelling of a cosmic battle between Satan and God. Makes really good movies, makes really good fiction, based on absolutely zero evidence. So, was there some sort of dispute? I'm guessing probably. The question comes from in Revelation where there's this battle described between Michael and the dragon. And they're saying that, well, that was the battle, that took place, but everything in that seems to point towards something that's going to happen in the future. So, whenever you are looking at prophecy, the big question you need to ask, is this something that's already happened, or is this something that's going to happen? In the case of Revelation, most of the book are things that have already happened. There are ways that people, that John particularly, told people that you could know that God was going to win despite all the things going on. And even if it cost you your life, ultimately God will be victorious. That's basically what the entire book's about. He does it in such a way that it's hard for people who aren't familiar with the literature at the time to understand it. But he's trying to tell this story so that the people who are reading it won't be persecuted even further than what they already are. Okay, so there's the impractical, kind of interesting origin of Satan discussion. This is a discussion of seeking people of peace. Whenever we want to spread out the message, Jesus here actually gives a model of how to do evangelism, or at least how it was to be done before his death. He sends out these people, and as Ron pointed out, kind of strangely, the more recent manuscripts say 70. The older manuscripts say 72. I'm not sure exactly why. My guess is that they probably rounded it off like we do sometimes. Regardless, there was a group that was sent out 2 by 2, and they were supposed to go into these villages and seek these sons of peace or people of peace. I think that this is a method of evangelism that we have neglected. Jesus is telling these disciples to look for people who are hospitable and open. Those are the 2 main requirements that he had to find. Whenever we do evangelism, it seems like most of the time we try to do it with big event type evangelism. So we'll hold something that tries to get the community's attention, and we'll try to bring them in based upon something that we're doing. What Jesus said is go find people who want to listen to you. I think that's something that we often don't think about. The people that are the most open are usually the ones who are the most likely to come to us. Makes sense. He says greet them. And I've talked about this before. The word there for peace is the equivalent to the Hebrew word shalom, which is how you say hello. It's how you greet somebody as a friend. And it's how you tell somebody, I actually want something good for you. Shalom, it means peace, and it implies peace to you. And it says, if they return the peace, stay there, abide there, learn about it. Are we looking for people of peace whenever we try to share the gospel? It's very uncommon for us to convince somebody who is combative and apprehensive and vindictive to want to be one of us. Because those are the type of things that generally people who want to be of the world embody. Jesus says there's good people out there. Go find them. There's people who want to learn about what it means to be Christ-like, to be a person of the kingdom. Go find them. Who are the people of peace in your life? Are there people who may be open to the God's message that you have neglected to take advantage of? I sometimes feel like we as Christians, and really just as people, don't want to put anything into the pot that could disturb what type of relationships are already there. Okay? If there's something that could keep you from having the same type of work relationship with somebody, you don't want to disturb that. If there's someone who has some sort of secular friendship, you don't want to disturb that. And usually we use the term, we want to keep the peace or something along those lines. Have you ever thought that if it's somebody who legitimately seems open and you choose not to tell them, that says that you care more about keeping the status quo than what you care about that person's salvation. And if they are someone you truly care about, and someone who is worth having a work relationship with, or a friendship with, maybe there's someone that you have some sort of hobby that you share in common. If they're important enough to have that small relationship, aren't they important enough to share the gospel with them? This week I challenge you to seek out people of peace. I want everyone to think about somebody who you might have in mind. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. Invite them to church. Invite them to one of our Wednesday night Bible classes. If you want, I'm going to have some classes on ISB. You don't even have to leave your house. I'll give you this link and you can listen in. There's lots of ways to reach people. There's a flip side to this, though, that we note kind of near the end of his sending them out. There's people of peace, people who are worth working with. He also says that there's some people that are not worth continuing to fight to help get that soul. He says, shake the dust off of your feet. I'm sometimes afraid that we spend so much time trying to reach certain people that maybe they're family members that we care about, maybe they are acquaintances that we have some sort of relationship with that we care about. We spend all of our energy trying to get them to come to Christ when they've made it very apparent that they are not interested. Jesus basically says, don't waste your time. Because it might not be the right time. That may come up later. I was speaking in Woodbury a few weeks ago where we were talking about my grandfather. My grandfather was baptized at age 72. 72. And he had probably been going to church for about 1 to 2 years before that. Those first years weren't the right time. They weren't appropriate. It hadn't gotten to the point where he understood what he needed. And maybe that's what you're dealing with. Invest your energy in people of peace. Be open with the gospel. Challenge people. And don't be afraid of what it might do to the relationships. This morning we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to become one of God's children. we have the opportunity to go from a person of peace to a child of peace. We can be peacemakers and spread the message of peace. If you've lost that, if you've no longer been the light of the world and you're bringing more darkness to the world that you live in, we can pray with you and for you as together we stand and as we sing.